the reading for tracking. I always like to start by mentioning, and as a side note, this will likely be an extra credit question for the final, but for you guys to know, the Secretary of Education at the federal and state level here in Indiana and nationally. Nationally, it's Betsy DeVos, and I think I've mentioned already before. It's kind of unprecedented. Uh, no real background in education, at least not like in terms of a degree or having worked previously for a school or an education system, or was never Secretary of Education at a state level. Um, has has basically got her experience at a nonprofit that advocates for school choice vouchers and charter schools. Um, and she inherited a lot of money, and her family very wealthy, and they've donated a lot of money in terms of politics to different politicians that promote school choice. All right. So what I want you to do by the end of the this reading, or for today's reading, is basically understand tracking and have a kind of awareness of it and ability to discuss it. So to be able to define it, talk about the effect it has on students, kind of note the connection to ability grouping, and then the contemporary issues with it today. And essentially, when we define it, I would look for the definition in the reading predominantly. I've had different readings on this topic before. The one that I assigned you guys, I think, has a pretty basic. It's just basically assigning kids different, sequence of courses or curriculum, basically based on their performance in school. I would say I would kind of add to that that it tends to have an occupational outcome related to it as well. So when we talk about tracking, we're not like it's becoming very popular now with technology to, Schoology and these other systems to have like, a system of keeping track of what students are doing and things like that. But this is different. What I'm talking about is putting kids on a kind of curricular pathway, um, based on perceptions about their ability. And I think that's really important because it's not about their skill level necessarily or how they're doing. Um, the example I always give is like when you start swimming lessons, you're a guppy and then whatever it is, till you get to be a dolphin and a shark or whatever. So that's kind of a skill development sequence, right? And it's very clear the like line of progression, and you kind of move through that based on your skill development. When this what we're doing here is sort of making an assumption about a kid's ability and putting them on the pathway towards an occupational outcome. So a kid's either going to end up in a kind of um, college prep sort of sequence of courses that are going to put them on task to have a upper level employment, or kind of a lower level track generally, which is often geared towards work in like service industries, or traditionally it had been like in factories. Tracking was very popular through the 20th century, and I'm kind of getting to this. It dropped off, but then it made a dramatic comeback in early 2000s. So through the 1990s, kind of like through the 90s, it really declined. Teachers were aware of it. It was criticized heavily, and it dropped off. And then I think what happened was with No Child Left Behind, there was a lot of pressure put on schools, and I think what schools did then is reverted back to tracking, and it really made a dramatic kind of back. What I also like to point out is that there's no kind of national policy around tracking in the United States. Now, in countries, we'll come to this, but in countries like Germany, there's a very clear system. Kids go to early elementary together, and then they hit a certain point, and they're divvied out literally physically into different schools. They're separated completely. We don't have a national policy around tracking. It's just sort of been, it kind of became part of the gene pool of schools. It's just the way schools kind of operated, and people replicated it. But I think until the 1980s, people weren't really critical of it and didn't start to really look at it. I always think you should think about your own experiences, maybe, and then it's helpful when you go into schools to try to kind of look and sort of see what kind of system they have. I do think a lot of students today, went to schools that at least like you know, and especially too, what happens sometimes if you have parents who are aware of the system, they're able to help you and kind of move you and get you into the right classes and things. So sometimes tracking isn't quite as rigid as it used to be, and you can move around to the different. And I often think if you have a system that's set up so kids can easily go through different level classes, then that's not really tracking to me. If you think about the analogy of a train track that's being used here, it's a predetermined outcome. Once you're sort of on this set of tracks, you're going to end up in a certain place. And so if it's easy to move or make corrections or change, then I think that's a better system. Um, so think about what you had. And certain things that I've noticed students have talked about in the past are things like, you know, when they went, maybe they had a friend in elementary school and they went on different paths, and then it's like if you don't see that person anymore, because like oftentimes like you just become separated from other students, and certain students won't really interact as much, be together, things like that. This is kind of from an earlier reading we did, but there's a lot of general assumptions I think that underlie tracking. And so even though it's different in different schools, I think there are some common characteristics to tracking. um, So again, as I mentioned, it declined in the 1990s, but the NAEP data has revealed a resurgence of tracking. The other issue that's in the article that we're reading is that there's a strong racial component to tracking, um, and I can just tell you that this has happened in a number of different areas. To give you an example, from Muncie, like Longfellow has been traditionally kind of the black, is in the black community of Muncie. Um, it and it's like that for a reason. That was the place that African Americans could live when they moved to Muncie. In the earlier 20th century, or through much of the 20th century. Um, and so Longfellow, the school there, tended to be predominantly African American. The demographics are changing quite a bit more recently now, but so you have neighborhood sort of localized elementary schools, but then those elementary schools all begin to filter into similar middle school and then similar high schools, and oftentimes those African American students ended up sort of being sort of resegregated through tracking essentially. Um, so um, this is something the last Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who was under President Obama, uh, began to notice, at least take notice of, and the Department of Education had began to focus on. Betsy DeVos, who I mentioned earlier, as the Secretary of Education today, has actually rescinded some of the guidelines and some of the things here. So, and I'll give you an example. I'll talk a little bit about what the Department of Ed has done, but the issues and evidence here I'll get into with race, but obviously major disparities that occur here. Um, Student achievement, you can see that heavily tracked districts um, perform worse. Student achievement declines. So the idea with tracking is always, at least I think the public, persona or face that people put on tracking is, well, we'll put those students in classes where they can receive the support they need. But that's not what happened. And in fact, and I mean, you might know this, but if a kid uh, begins to be put in certain ability group levels, that are when they're in elementary school and then begin to be tracked into a low track system, the gap between those students and the other students in other tracks widens over time. The effects of tracking are cumulative. And what that means is over time, when you go into a low track, you fall further and further behind. Um, and that's true not just within the United States, but they cite evidence in the reading that with countries that have heavily tracked systems like Germany that I mentioned earlier, there too you see a disparity opening up um, among students. And then in resources, um, you know, high track, or the gifted programs, or high track programs tend to have more resources, more experienced teachers. Um, this was a quote from the reading, and to give you those examples are the Maplewood District and Columbia High School. Um, So again, Germany, an increase in the achievement gap. The classes that suffer most are obviously the lower classes, um, kids in poverty, and are traditionally underrepresented groups have tended to be the ones that suffer the most. Um, what the Department of Ed does um, when they step into a situation where there's a huge disparity among um, whites and African American students in tracked classes, they help the school district. It's not an overbearing situation or a penalty. They just help the school district. I mean, they do apply pressure, but they put pressure on the school district to develop a plan, their own plan to deal with the issue. And I'll give you some examples of some of the things schools have done. This was a situation. The gentleman, Mr. Fields, his daughter, and this is helpful to remember. His daughter, African American girl, um, it denied access into an advanced math class. She was qualified. She had met all the qualifications. The only thing she was lacking was a teacher recommendation, and so she wasn't admitted to the higher level. And he, went to the ACLU and Civil Rights Project, and they filed a suit against the school district with the tracking issue. And to give you some of the statistics here, you can see that white students and African American students are pretty balanced, between 40 and 50%, and they're roughly sort of balanced here. But when you get to the upper level math classes, you can see an overrepresentation of white students significantly, and underrepresentation here of African American students. And likewise, at Columbia, with AP classes, a huge disparity. Even though, again, when you look at the enrollment numbers, African American students here are actually more, um, or in the majority here. Um, you know, when these plans are put in place to deal with tracking, the idea is not to necessarily get rid of accelerated programs or to do away with different levels in a sense. It's just coming up with a plan um, to deal with them. I believe in the case of the GATE program here, what they did was actually set a kind of, you know, to make they put a system in place to make the upper levels representative of the percentage of students that they had in the school, um, which I say definitely to deal with it. The basis upon which the Department of Education can get involved um, is the under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what I want you to be familiar with, specifically Title VI here, outlaws discrimination against programs that receive federal financial assistance. So schools receive federal money, federal support for special education programs and for Title I and for other programs and grants and things like that. To be eligible for that money, the Department of Ed has leverage when it comes to schools, and so that's kind of the basis they've used. Um, so one of the things I like students on this topic to think about is tracking from their own perspective, how they feel about it, and some of the problems associated with it, and as a teacher. And what they cite in the reading that I wanted you to be familiar with is about, I think it's about 46% of teachers feel like it is hard to manage the differences that are that are in their classrooms. I think with the pressure they're under, and I do think that's a very relevant and important issue to kind of deal with. I'm not always sure, again, though, that the tracking is necessarily the best way to deal with it. The other thing I think is there's sort of a myth of a completely homogeneous classroom. Um, I don't think you're always going to have that kind of challenge of dealing with disparities among different students and performances and things like that. Um, so